This is Terms of Reference podcast number 150.
I've joked in the past, and it's kind of sad to see it come to pass, but I've joked in the past that it's not clear to me that shrinking or even killing USAID would actually be a net bad to the world.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. I'm having a hard time believing that we've made it to episode 150 here on the Terms of Reference podcast. I'm grateful you've taken the time to join me on this journey, and I hope you'll stick around and contribute your voice to the rest of the conversation going forward. But even more difficult for me to believe is that I feel like we're still just getting started. And there's so much to learn from the experts we have on the show and the experiences they bring to the table. Today's guest, Professor Chris Blattman, is no exception. Chris is the Ramalee E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago in the Harris School of Public Policy. And he's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, among many other things that you'll hear us discuss on the show. He's a heavyweight in the world of understanding what works, and more importantly, what doesn't in aid and development. As you hear on the show, Chris thinks he's a professor because he was a failed development professional. This is actually a lucky turn for the rest of us because he's a critical voice in the growing R&D community focused on the development and aid sector. You'll hear us talk about how research finds its way into practice and how we learned that microfinance doesn't work to alleviate poverty. We also talk about why you can't test programs in programming, but rather you have to test the assumptions those programs are built on in order to find out what works. We round out our discussion on what the future of the social sector could look like over the next 5 or so years. I spoke with Chris in Chicago. But before we get started, a word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks. I'm glad we could do this.
Chris, you've actually just made a recent shift in your life, but where do we find you sitting today? You're a world traveler.
So right now I'm at the University of Chicago. I'm in the public policy school, the Harris Public Policy, and I'm sitting in my office.
Excellent. So you stole my introduction. You are a professor at the University of Chicago in the Harris Public Policy School. Why don't we start by you telling us what is it that you focus on? What's your research all about, and why is it important for people who are in aid and development?
I guess a lot of my work revolves around working with the very poor and often high-risk young men. And so some of that's been around how do you reintegrate victims of conflict, young men and women, when they're young men, and especially the high-risk young men, how do we keep them, how do we sort of reduce the propensity for violence? And then young men tend to sometimes organize into rebel groups or street gangs or things of this nature. And that's a lot of my work right now, is trying to think about how these gangs and armed groups operate and how you might reduce some of the worst forms of violence there.
What has your research revealed? I mean, what are there mind-blowing headlines that you could throw on the table or is it pretty nuanced?
Well, no, I think there's a few things. I guess if I had to come up with punchlines, I'd say one is that people, men and women, tend to be pretty resilient, even when exposed to a lot of violence. And so whether it's socially or psychologically, some specialized services are probably needed, but probably the biggest damage is economic. Young men and women, whether they're in an armed group or victims of an armed group, get sort of economically hammered by warfare, and that's really hard to recover from. And so some of my first work sort of emphasized that that's probably where policy and programs should emphasize. And then I started studying some of these and came down to finding just often huge levels of success with giving people startup capital to sort of reaccumulate capital and start small enterprises and raise their incomes, even in the form of just simple cash, finding that really effective. And then more recently, I've been looking at some non-economic interventions for the smaller group of people, especially young men who are violent. And I've been looking at cognitive behavior therapy and other types of economic programs and trying to figure out what works and finding some really powerful effects of really short courses of behavioral therapy focused on self-control and changing social identity and really seeing big drops in violence. So that's been some of my past research.
So then there's a lot to chew on there. I'm interested in how you shape and how you think about your career. Are you a development professional or a humanitarian aid professional first and a professor second? Or are you a professor at a university that does this on the side, or how does that integrate? I kind of wonder how do you vision yourself in your own mind?
I'm not a professor because I'm a failed development professional, because I never really tried very hard to be a development professional. I think I wanted to do development policy and run programs, but I was really interested in what works and why, and I really like getting mired in the details of certain interventions and understanding what we learn much more broadly from that. And so I think the academy and doing research is a really natural fit, but I do applied research even by the standards of my policy school colleagues. And so it's sort of a hybrid that lets me also stay a bit of arm's length from organizations and not be encumbered by that. That sort of gives me the freedom to sort of, I guess you could think, I feel like I'm the R&D department, or one man in the R&D department of the aid and development apparatus.
It's interesting. I recently had a conversation with the CEO of FHI 360 on this podcast, and one of his huge pieces, again, his name's Patrick Fine.
Yeah, I know Patrick.
He was a huge proponent of, where do we need to go in the next 3 to 5 years or even 10 years in the sector is funding that research and development. And he's looking at it from an internal organizational perspective, they don't have the funds to kind of put these long-term projects together. Do you see that as well, or do you feel there's enough synergy, enough symbiosis between the academies, as you say, the education, or the university world and development organizations, or is there more needed?
I don't have the same time pressures and organizational pressures that I might have if I were in an organization. Now, some aid organizations, my wife runs the research department for International Rescue Committee. They've actually started an internal research and development department where they're testing and piloting and trying to figure out what works. So it can be done in these organizations, but it's a struggle, and very few organizations are doing that because I think it's challenging. Even the funding model is challenging. Whereas in academia, we've been set up to do this for a long time. So having essentially labs in the field and piloting different things and trying to understand what's going on and being able to take our time is a luxury, but also something I think that's pretty important. So that's, and I think it's been helpful. So there's been this symbiotic relationship, I think.
What are the practical nuts and bolts about how someone who's not you uses your work, right? So you've gone out and you have some findings about how people are reintegrating from conflict, or you have some findings about, cash. So, are they using your theories to craft programs around, design and craft programs? Do they call you in as an expert and say, look, what do we need to do? How does that actually function?
Yeah, I don't know that any one research or any one paper can have always has that direct impact. There's too many researchers, too many papers, and we're not always skilled or incentivized to get that information out there. Now, I happen to personally spend a lot of time on that, as do a lot of my colleagues, and that I think that means the work does get out. But I think the way it really actually changes things is maybe not one study, but maybe the accumulation of several studies along a question starts to change how it changes the conversation. So academics like me will write synthetic articles that sort of try to bring something together, or people like Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee will write a book like Poor Economics. And I think that's one way that changes the conversation, and then changes generally how people think about the problems and what solutions work, and then that gradually changes what people do. And I see that happening more than, say, just picking up one paper and running with it. And indeed, I don't think anyone ever should pick up one paper and run with it, because that's usually not sufficient.
Yeah, and again, going back to that Patrick Fine, he said that FHI 360 last year, they published, I think it was 180 some odd peer-reviewed journal articles last year alone in their organization. So, the body of work is really more important than any one paper, I guess, would in any case, right?
Right, and that area where they're working, especially around health and children, that's always, and for years and years, been an area where I think the research has really thrived, and it's been very evidence-based. That's been less true, I would say, in say, poverty alleviation. That's been less true in peace building and conflict resolution. These are areas where historically there really wasn't much to go on, and other than people's experience. And experience wasn't a terrible guide, but it didn't let us discriminate between, what was maybe not very effective and what was really, really effective.
How do you go about building that evidence base for conflict programs, right? I believe that you're actually right now looking to kick off some of those programs that's seeking to build that evidence base. Take us through that.
Yeah, well, I'm figuring it out myself right now.
That's the beauty. I love extemporaneous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so in the next few months, if things go, so I work with two research organizations. One is based at MIT. It's called the Poverty Action Lab. And the other sister organization is in New Haven, Connecticut, and it's called Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA. So people call them JPAL and IPA, the J being a donor for the Poverty Action Lab.
Yeah, we've had Andy Duflo of IPA on the show. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they're sister organizations that both focus on rigorous impact evaluation, including a big focus on randomized controlled trials of development and aid programs, not just to evaluate individual programs, but to really challenge ideas about how different processes work, whether it's what does it mean to be poor and what are the causes of poverty and what alleviates it. And the bread and butter of these organizations has been working with academics like me, so dozens and dozens and dozens of academics around the world and typically some of the best institutions, to use programs as a vehicle for understanding how the world works at the same time that we sort of learn what kinds of programs work. And I think they've really revolutionized how we think about the extreme poor and how we think about microfinance and how we think about certain health and education programs. And there's really little evidence, whether it's from these organizations or really any of us, on what works in conflict resolution and violence reduction and crime reduction. I mean, there's a lot of people have a good understanding of this because there's a lot of people that they're operating in the world. They're smart. They've written about this. But in terms of testing programs and using programs and rigorous evaluation as a vehicle for understanding these things, it's really, just a handful of people have been doing a handful of studies. So I think, when I look at how our understanding of, say, microfinance or understanding of poverty alleviation has changed, I think one of the things that's driven this is taking really core interventions that are out there that we do over and over again, because they're rooted in some assumption about how the world works. So if we give people skills training to relieve their poverty, there's an assumption that that's a solution to a problem. We don't always state what the problem is, but in that case, we're assuming that the problem is people have high returns to skills, but they can't access those skills for some reason. And so if we relieve that supply side constraint and we give them skills, then they're going to leap forward. That turns out not to be true. Most of the time when you give people skills, they don't leap forward. So something about that assumption is wrong. And we can learn about that by testing programs. And so, in microfinance, when we give people access to microfinance, you're assuming that they have high returns to capital. And if they get access to it at a particular interest rate, let's say it's 10 or 20% a month, which is not unusual, then they're going to be able to invest and grow businesses. That turns out not to be true either. It seems to be true that people need capital, and they have really high returns to things like cash in terms of starting businesses and getting big returns on investment. But with this relatively expensive microfinance, it's not usually economical to invest it because the interest rates are too high and the repayment periods are too quick, and the repayment starts right away. So they're not really good investment vehicles. But you could craft microfinance programs that are good investment vehicles.
I was just going to say, are you basically underlying the fact we got to take Muhammad Yunus's Nobel Prize away, or?
Why can I say this with a degree of confidence is because we now have about 8 randomized control trials from basically every continent in the world and a host of other evidence. And it's almost impossible to find evidence that microfinancers, people really like microfinance, that people are taking it up. So there's something about it. People want to smooth out what they consume, especially because they have sort of very volatile income sources, and often they need to spend when they don't have income, and they're willing to pay a very high interest rate for that. And if you don't have access to microfinance, then getting access is a big deal. That's great, but it's not relieving your poverty. So I sort of think of it like microwaves. Getting a microwave makes your life easier, and everyone buys it. Everyone probably, at least here in the U.S., owns a microwave because it makes their life better, but it hasn't it's not a poverty alleviation tool. So that's probably the right way to think about microfinance. And we know this, and we know the reasons, and we've actually now understand something relatively deep about poverty and what constraints are holding poor people back through this vehicle of impact evaluation, and doing this in many places in many different ways. So we were wrong about microfinance as a tool for ending poverty, and that's how it goes.
Yeah, sure.
And
but
we haven't.
Those are the kind of answers that we need, right? I mean, that's exactly what you were saying in the beginning, that let's stop working on assumptions and let's start actually having answers.
Exactly. But so I think maybe the most important thing to realize is that a research agenda for understanding what works in something like conflict resolution and violence reduction would sort of not be very successful if it just focused on testing programs. It has to test assumptions, and it has to sort of test our model of the world through the vehicle of testing programs. And if you're not trying to test your assumptions, and if you're not testing your model of the world because you're just randomly testing idiosyncratic programs, then you're just doing a whole bunch of really expensive audits.
So break that down sort of in real practical terms for me. What's the difference between testing assumptions and testing programs? I mean, can you give me a real tangible example of those two?
Sure. So let's take something which I only realized I was testing assumptions and a model of the world after the fact. So I was in Liberia for many years working on various programs to rehabilitate ex-combatants and other, criminal young men and just men maybe on the cusp of these things. And at the time, these were expensive programs. And a friend of mine who worked for the UN High Commission for Refugees said, I have this other program on peace education, and I'd love you to evaluate it. I thought, oh my God, this looks like a dog. Why would I evaluate this program? And then he gave me an answer, which is, I'll give you 3 Land Cruisers and free fuel for 2 or 3 years to subsidize your other projects.
Yes, I love it. Perfect.
Which is a gift in Liberia because, my goodness, that place is hard to get around.
Well, the memes of Liberia that, where like an entire SUV will be just absorbed by the mud is amazing.
Exactly, yeah.
Great.
Oh, and the repairs and so for someone for an organization just give us vehicles and repair them and keep them on the road and give us free fuel, and that was a big deal. So I said yes, I will evaluate your stupid peace education program. Thinking, so this was a program where at first glance it looked like they were having a bunch of very charismatic Liberians who believed in teaching people how to be peaceful with one another, going to hundreds of villages to trying to get basically 1 in 6 of all the adults in the village into their training. And I have sort of a low opinion of training. It's sort of like everyone thinks, the natural thing if you're an aid worker is to think, if only I could lecture these poor villagers on what they ought to do because I'm the smart, accomplished person, then they would listen and they'll have the answer and then they'll go fix their problems. That to me is not a development strategy, but it's that's a common theme underlying a lot of aid programs. Is people from the capital going out and lecturing people in the village. So I thought, I'll do this and I'll put another nail in the coffin of that approach. Because they wanted to get 1 in 6 of the adults in and just teach them how to be more peaceful with one another. But then as I started studying it more, I started reflecting on the theory of conflict. And a theory of conflict that I think is really influential in academic circles, but a lot of people don't. It makes a lot of sense when you hear it, but a lot of people don't think of it right away. And this is the idea that in theory, fighting's costly, right? So for me to fight you, my neighbor, over a property dispute, or for me as a country to fight the neighboring country and to get violent, like that's inherently costly. I trample your property, or I punch you in the nose, or you punch me in the nose, or maybe something more serious happens. And of course, incredibly more serious things happen when neighboring countries go to war. And if we know that this is going to be really, really costly, then there actually exists, and we're going to fight in order to get a different division of the pie. But in doing so, we're going to shrink the pie. And then whatever slice we get, maybe we get a bigger slice, maybe we don't. So if we hadn't shrunk the pie and we just bargained efficiently, then we'd actually probably be better off in expectation. So the whole idea is that there basically exists a division of the existing pie that is always better than your expected division of the pie in future, especially given all the uncertainty. And so there's sort of a puzzle, but why do people fight at all? One of the answers is because you don't understand how strong your enemy is, and you don't maybe know how far they're willing to go. And so it's hard to divide that pie now. Those what we would call information asymmetries, like we have different information, and we're going to mean we can't actually, the bargaining is going to break down, and we're going to have to fight until we do get a division of that smaller pie. But the other thing is that we might, I can't really trust you to commit to whatever bargain we strike, because you may have an incentive to renege on that, or maybe to mount a sneak attack or something and get me while I'm temporarily weak, especially if power balances are going to change over time. You're going to be rich or poor, more or less powerful in unpredictable ways. So we call that the commitment problem. And so that's sort of a classic theory of conflict that says that that the reason we have all these disputes and we devolve into fighting is because we can't commit to solutions or we can't reach solutions because we have different information. And so turns out what peace education meant in this case was really what in America we call alternative dispute resolution. This is something that the courts use regularly. And alternative dispute resolution training is about teaching people skills and practices and trying to instill norms of behavior. So things that the community sort of, all collectively believe is correct to do and then enforce informally. It's trying to create, instill a bunch of behaviors that are trying to get people to share information. So information about their interests, information about how hard they're willing to fight, information about why this is important to them in order to resolve those information asymmetries. And it's also trying to get people to collectively agree as a community. This is why they wanted 1 in 6 in the room. That if we get enough people in from the community in that room, then we can sort of change the general consensus about what's an appropriate kind of behavior. If you're not allowed to, if you're in a Liberian village and you have a property dispute with your neighbor, he can go to the village elder and you can go to the village chief, and then you get different answers. And then one of you goes to the formal court and gets the answer you want, and then that guy goes to maybe the religious leaders and he gets another. There's which forum is the legitimate forum for resolving this dispute is, so nobody can commit to a forum. And so they really focused on getting people to agree to specific forum and always commit to that resolution. And in that way, so they, without ever saying it, they were actually attacking the roots of conflict, the theoretical roots of conflict. And then what we saw was not a reduction in disputes, because disputes are ever present, but we saw those disputes as a result of this program become less violent, and they tended to get resolved more quickly. And long-running disputes that had been festering tended to get resolved because they had this sort of new toolkit that. And so the amazing thing about this study is that by doing this and by studying this, I think this was one of the very few empirical tests of a relatively important but kind of esoteric theory of violence and theory of conflict. And so I went in just testing a program, but I came out, testing my assumptions about the world and really believing this theory of conflict in a way I hadn't believed it before. And so by accident, I sort of got to the right place.
Give me a time frame on this, on two things. One, both the work that you did, so the evaluation work, the testing, but also the change itself in these communities, right? Was it something that took place over days, months, weeks, years?
Years. And I say that because I know that because it took years to do each of these evaluations. Like every employment program, every peace building intervention, I can take months and years for the effects to manifest themselves. And then of course you want to keep going back to see if they persist or
I was just going to
disappear.
say, have you been back or have you kept in touch to see if things persist?
Yeah, so we most of my projects, the answer is it's both fortunately and unfortunately yes, because it's just these things are so cumbersome. I'm going back 8 years after a cash transfer program in Uganda. I guess it's going to be 9 years now. We're going back 5 years after an intervention in Ethiopia. And then in this Liberia, this peace building example, we went back first we went after a year or maybe 18 months on average across these villages. And then we went back after 3 years. By 3 years, the effects had dissipated, in part because a lot of these disputes had been resolved. So there was a historical backlog of property disputes. And maybe it had dissipated because, these things can only stick so far. It's hard to say. But so we haven't gone back after 3 years because we saw things dissipate after 3 years. But for 3 years, there were less violent and more quickly resolved property disputes at what was a pretty fragile time in Liberian history. Let
me throw you a curveball. How does what you just described, and not only the fundamental assumptions of, conflict and then, putting in alternative dispute resolutions, et cetera, but, taking into account then the time frame that all happened, and how do you now juxtapose that with the immediacy that we're seeing in the world today with the Twitter world, essentially, with social media, with Facebook, and what we're seeing? Not, obviously it's there in the United States, it's all over the world, but is this now posing an even a greater problem to you in your conflict studies as well, because there's this immediacy of attack, retaliation, etc.? Or is it's just the same old game, there's just another platform?
In what sense? You mean the conflict between, you're not talking about aid right now, you're talking about conflict between
I'm you kind
like
of
Twitter feuds.
You've fully intrigued me with the theory of conflict, right? And so now I'm wondering, is conflict more prevalent? Are people willing to enter conflicts more often simply because they have these anonymous platforms, but then also there's just this immediacy of being able to put whatever your viewpoint is on the table, and he who speaks first usually wins and gets out there and can sort of run with it.
Right. Yeah, I've never thought about it as applied to Twitter. I mean, it's a bit different. It's not clear what the stakes are. So, I mean, a conflict over property or a conflict over territory or a conflict over some group of people or resources is typically the way we think of it, because there's some pie that's getting divided. I don't know what the pie is that's getting divided in Twitter, other than maybe some sort of sense of pride or I'm being right. And so I'd have to think about how it works. So I don't know. Maybe the short answer is I don't know what the pie that's getting divided in is Twitter. And if the pie is sort of, maybe everybody can walk away. The pie isn't necessarily zero sum in Twitter. If both people can also walk away thinking that they outsmarted the other person.
Sure.
But you can think of, like, when you do see two people, say, on two sides of a political divide, I hear those exist in the US right now. When two people on the sides of a political divide are attacking one another and talking, like, what's really, really clear is they have very different assumptions about the way the world works. And then they're arguing at a higher level, though. They're based on those assumptions. They're saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And they're not necessarily saying, well, I believe this because this is my assumption. And then they don't necessarily get to arguing about the assumption. Sometimes they do. That's a classic conflict resolution strategy, which is in some ways about clear communication. And maybe you could call that resolving an information asymmetry. It's like, let's actually talk about our assumptions about the world, because if we had the same assumptions, then we might draw more similar conclusions. And so let's talk about the premises of our argument. Now at that point, you can argue. Clearly, there's a lot of argument over facts still, and it's hard to win those arguments. But because people seem to want to hold on to their particular facts, and so I don't know. So I'd have to think about that. But I think it's a little bit different, maybe because the stakes don't seem very high.
Well, then let me ask a different immediacy question. You're going to embark on these new research projects that are going to take you over the next couple of years. The work that you just described in Liberia, it went over several years. The development organizations, the humanitarian organizations that we all think about that are out there today, they're handed contracts where they have to deliver results in 6 months, 1 year, these kinds of things. What's your thought on that? Is that just an unrealistic, behavior change, real results like that? Is it just an unrealistic thing, or are there a way to square those? To kind of square that circle. I've used that analogy before, and I continually get it wrong.
Right. Well, just last week I was in Medellin in Colombia, where I'm starting a big study. There's maybe somewhere between 200 and 400 street gangs in Medellin, who are many of whom, maybe most of whom, are quite powerful in the sense that they're kind of little states within a state, and in their neighborhood they would be far more important than the judiciary or the police in terms of providing security or delivering services or regulating the markets. And they're these sort of youth-driven criminal organizations. So the city government obviously would like to improve matters, and they have. I mean, this is an improvement over 20 or 25 years ago, when it was a kingpin like Pablo Escobar running the city, and so power has gradually been fragmented into smaller and smaller gangs. So, but it's still a problem, and so they have really immediate needs. They're saying, well, we have to do something in the next 6 months, and we of course have to do everything in the next 3 years, because then we might be out of power. So they need some answers, and they need to start doing things based on best guesses. But along the way, we can also just say, well, all right, we'll tell you the best that we can tell you and give you the best advice and information we can, but we're still going to spend the next year trying to understand these combos. We're going to basically go to every little neighborhood, every little barrio in the city, and we're going to qualitatively try to understand what the combo is and how they're organized, and which combos are strong and which are not, and then look over time at why we think some are stronger or not, and then reevaluate what we think would work. And so probably in a year, we'll say, actually, this thing that you were doing, or the best guess based on these assumptions, it doesn't seem to have worked, and it didn't work because now we understand these armed organizations differently. And so it suggests a different strategy. So, they have to move as quickly as they can, but this is going to be a 20-year problem at best, right? If they reduce the power of street gangs the fastest conceivable rate through the most successful set of programs, it would probably still take 10 or 20 years. So they might have this immediate time frame to try to fix the problem on their watch. But I sort of have the luxury of taking the long view and saying, well, if we get this right now and we change the way we think about it, then maybe it'll take 20 or 30 years instead of 40 or 50 years.
So I want to talk about the future for a little while here. What does the next 5 years look like, from your perspective on how organizations, I mean, you have your wife over at IRC, how aid organizations are going to be interacting in the world and what their expectations are for delivering programs, especially as it's based around your research. We have a very heavy push of research such as yours coming into the sector, but we may be seeing some pretty big changes right now with the Trump administration slashing budgets and changing the way that these organizations can even function. Do you see any big game changers or how do you envision the next 3 to 5 years playing out?
Yeah, with U.S. policy, I've kind of given up making predictions right now. I think it is important to sort of play a slight wait and see attitude. So certainly what the Trump administration decides to do will be very important in its aid. At the same time, I just don't know how important. I don't think the U.S. has generally been a leader in aid policy. So I don't think it's I think it's often been, it tends to be very insulated, so that I meet people in other country donors, like whether it's the UK government or other European governments, or I meet people in developing country governments, or I talk to people in NGOs, and they have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on. They're reading social media, they're reading papers, they're reading books, they're kind of abreast, I think, of some of so when academics and when other people, it's not just academics, but when people who are doing this innovation and this R&D are changing the conversation, this is filtering into the conversation. And I find that U.S. aid organizations, especially USAID, it's really shocking to me how they seem to be really focused in on themselves and are really totally, the average person is totally ignorant of that conversation. They're not following it. And so, and as a result, I think they just sort of muddle ahead with a set of projects that has some kind of internal logic. And with some things like PEPFAR, this President's Fund for AIDS, and basically providing, for example, AIDS and tuberculosis treatments across Africa to millions and millions and millions of people. Like, that's just, to me, an obviously good idea. And that's just, money in one end and results at the other in a simplistic way. And so sometimes they muddle along with this objective in mind, and it does good. And then, honestly, I just struggle to see many USAID programs that have ever really struck me as effectual or influencing the conversation. I think there are some, but it's not most. I don't know what, I've joked in the past, and it's kind of sad to see it come to pass, but I've joked in the past that it's not clear to me that shrinking or even killing USAID would actually be a net bad to the world.
That's a really fantastic viewpoint. So again, kind of echoing some of the more recent conversations we've had, that this could actually be kind of a moment of supreme opportunity for either social enterprises, social entrepreneurs, anybody who's innovative, to not only show that they add value, but show that they get results. Do you agree?
Yeah, I guess it's so uncertain, and there's just a lot of risks, and a lot of good programs will get cut. So I don't want to sound too cavalier about it, but I will say the Bush administration, George W. Bush, injected a lot of innovation within government. PEPFAR is an example, but the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and I think USAID became a lot more effective over the last 10 years because they effectively had a lot of competition, not just from those organizations, but from the fact that a majority of aid was starting to go through places like the Department of Agriculture and Department of Labor and Department of Defense. And so by forcing these organizations, government organizations, to compete for some of these funds, I think broadly that was probably a good thing. Now, what this administration sounds like they might be doing is completely shrinking the amount of funds. We'll see if they actually do that, but they'll shrinking the amount of funds that go. So that'll, we'll see how that plays out in this, especially in this more competitive space. It's not clear to me. I think something like PEPFAR and if millions and millions and millions of people are getting treatment for AIDS right now, and somehow their lives literally depend on that, and that gets cut, that's a travesty. Like, that's very scary. But some of the other stuff, it's not clear to me. Maybe it's an opportunity for a shakeup in the longer term and a more effective aid apparatus in the U.S.
Are there particular things, shiny objects, programs that you consider disruptors right now in the aid and development business? I know, your particular research led you to Cash, right?
Right.
As a particular.
And so I think Cash is one, and Give Directly, which is really one of the organizations that's been leading the fray, is a great example. But so, the governments, especially in Latin America, were some of the early movers with conditional cash transfers. And so, Give Directly is a disruptor in terms of really, really hyper low cost delivery of unconditional cash transfers. But overall, I'd say that's a big change. That a lot of people, it upsets a lot of people depending on your mindset. But from the perspective of dollars, from the perspective of we can either give people stuff to make them better off, or we can give people cash. 9 times out of 10, it's better and cheaper to give them cash. I mean, you can help a lot more people more efficiently, and it's probably less corrupt. And so that's a good thing. But if you start from the premise that you don't like giving poor people anything, then giving them cash is kind of upsetting.
Any other disruptors beside cash that you like to put on the table?
That is a good question. There must be plenty. It might be a lack of really terrific examples out there. Let me think. Let's circle back to that, and I'll think about it more in the back of my head while we're talking about other stuff.
Okay. Do you see something like cash? One of the things that I often ask on the show is how do these particular things like cash or innovations that are bubbling up, how do they become just sort of part and parcel to the standard work that it becomes a no-brainer? Like, of course, we're going to do a program that's a poverty alleviation, and cash is going to be the thing. Is there a way to assure that integration, or is it just does it just become something that's, as in your line of work, the evidence is continues to mount, and so therefore people accept it and it works, or is there a way to accelerate that?
Good question. So a lot of organizations, by accident or on purpose, or because they have been innovating, and sometimes because they're forced to innovate, have been offering cash for many, many years. So when you talk to some of the old humanitarians, for example, they'll say, oh, we tried this in 1993 and, Rwanda, and it was great, and nobody listened to us. And so there was sort of this base of experienced people out there who so a lot of experimentation that was going on. That's a very slow process. I think it's sped up for a couple of reasons. One is the research. I think the research helped dispel some of the reservations that people had, legitimate reservations. Like, it's not obvious that giving cash to a 20-year-old is a good development strategy. For lots of reasons, because we're all 20 years old at one point, and we can think we probably don't really
giving
trust
me
our
cash
selves.
when I was 20 probably wasn't the best idea.
Right. So it doesn't feel like exactly. And I think research has dispelled a lot of that. And I think organizations like Give Directly sort of trying to scale this up in a really dynamic way have been helpful. But to be honest, I think what's really driven the cash thing in the end is that as countries like the UK and others have scaled their commitments to give aid, because they set these percentage of GDP targets, which are A, high, and B, of a growing pie, which is a growing level of GDP. Every year they have to spend more money. And they just don't know how to do that efficiently. And so they've literally just had to start dropping cash out of helicopters. And then they call these community-driven development programs and community-driven reconstruction and conditional cash transfers. But once you start trying to pump more money out the door with a minimum of administration and administrative cost, and with a minimum of risk of corruption, suddenly just dumping money out of helicopters onto people or communities is sort of a necessity. And honestly, I think that's a big part of it.
I kind of have two more questions for you, and I'm wondering if we should circle back to, are there other innovations coming down the pipe that you like, for, just not to lead the witness anyway, but technology. Obviously mobile technologies out there. We've got drones, we've got mobile phones, these kinds of things. Is there anything that's technology driven? Any new kind of process? Any kind of new way of thinking that's come out of your research or other people's research? That
I've been super skeptical about technology all along. My first job in development was to go in 2000. I was a master's student at the Kennedy School, and one of my professors was working with an organization in India that was going to deliver internet by radio to isolated rural villages. So this may be hard for young people today to imagine that
internet
somehow
by radio. I'm freaking out right now.
Anyway, so there were no cables out. If you wanted to deliver internet in 2000 to villages, because the internet revolution happened. I'd worked in consulting during the internet boom in Toronto, when everybody was when the bubble was as big as it ever got. And at this moment, then people were thinking about, how do we bring this out to rural areas in the poorest countries, which had no prospect of getting the internet for many, 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 many years, and may still not have it in some cases. And satellites and this and that, this just didn't exist. And so one of the technology universities, IIT Madras in India, developed this technology of radio, really cheap radio, so just delivered over radio waves, and you could get decent speeds, especially given what you needed to download at that time, and it was going to deliver internet, and it was going to give farmers market prices and help them access their government and order birth certificates online and and it just kind of turned out to be I ended up looking at it and I'd realized, well, yeah, it would give farmers information about rice prices in the next village or the next district, but there were 400 other barriers to actually selling your rice somewhere else. High transport costs, different rice varieties, government regulation, all these things. So information wasn't the constraint, or cheap access to information wasn't the constraint that was binding people. And when they did use mobile phones or technology, a lot of it was just for pleasure. It was consumption. They were talking to their family more, and things that were valuable. Everyone seems to love this, and it's obviously important, but it's just consumption. It's not going to transform poverty. So I became an early skeptic, and then I really have not seen much in 16 years that's led me to rethink that. I can't think of many good examples where anything really revolutionary has happened from technology, from the perspective of actually, really radically changing people's poverty, or really radically changing their control over government. Whereas I've seen other solutions like cash. Now, delivering cash over mobile phones and reducing financial transaction costs on the margin is a great thing, and technology is doing that. To get microfinance rates down from 10 or 20% a month to 3 or 4 or 5% a month, technology can be part of that solution. But that's not some radical transformation or change. That's a broad systemic change that requires a lot of regulatory change, that requires a lot of other things, and then technology will help keep those transaction costs down. But it's not some sort of savior.
So the two questions I have to ask you are two that I ask every guest here on this particular innovation series. And one of them is, who do you pay attention to? I mean, you've already rattled off 100 names over the last 45 minutes here, but do you have blogs that you follow? Do you have Twitter feeds you follow? You have magazines you read, journals, particular people that you think, what are your top 5 that people would go read them?
So let's see. The one person who for 10 years I've faithfully read every day, and maybe the only person who sustains my interest, and this is sort of a broader intellectual interest, but occasionally touches on development interests, is Tyler Cowen at Marginal Revolution. But given that he's maybe the most gifted blogger on the planet, and maybe half or maybe all of your listeners are already familiar with him, to sort of stay on top of what's happening in international development or just research in general, I subscribe to, you can go to the NBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and sign up to get an email every Monday with all the working papers and all of economics that are being delivered. And you can suggest that you can just sort of specify that you only want development economics, for example. I also take a look at what's happening at BREAD. This is the Bureau for something. It's basically the development research, a place where people put out a lot of development research working papers. And just as a way, and I read the abstracts. I often never look at the papers, but I read the abstracts, and it gives me a sense of what's going on. And I really like that. And it's just minutes out of that, and it's a nice little information source. You can do the same thing with Social Science Research Network, SSRN, and just subscribe to get emails every day or once a week along specific research. And you'll just get whatever papers are coming out anywhere in the world. And so I would say that's like one thing that not a lot of people do. But if you're a journalist or if you're just a regular person or a development worker, you can sign up to get these research papers tailored somewhat to your interests, skim them, once or twice a week. And it gives you sort of, and I guarantee you once a month, you'll see something that really catches your interest. It reads, maybe it changes your mind about something.
So my last question is, you may have already touched upon this with our discussion about cash, but is there a shiny new object or a process or something that you're super excited about that we haven't discussed that you see coming down the pipe that you'd like to give a shout out to, geek out on?
I have to say I'm not very excited about anything right now in particular, like nothing shiny. I'm really excited by seeing a lot more people study gangs and study armed groups and study violence and I think that's happened. I think just the phenomenon of many more people doing many more rigorous things, trying to understand violence. Of the poor countries in the world today, half of them are growing at like 5 or 6% a year, meaning they're going to be middle income status in 10 or 20 years. And by 2030, really, the poor countries that are left are going to be the fragile states. It's going to be the places that haven't solved these political problems and that continue to be violent. And so development is going to be the business of figuring out political solutions in fragile states and how to mitigate conflict and violence in about 15 years. And so the fact that not just researchers, but big organizations like the World Bank and others have picked up on this and are planning for it and are putting the resources there is really good news to me. But I don't think shiny objects aren't going to fix that problem. That's just a really, really, really freaking messy problem. Finding political solutions where there haven't been political solutions for all of human history. And so it's just going to be really hard. And so I think, the age of shiny objects is over. I think it's about really hard politics now.
Chris, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking your time today.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.